This was recorded by Dr. P. L. Goodwin. All copyright reserved. The title of this is The Conscious and the Subconscious Mind. Now, before we go on to the structure of the conscious and subconscious mind, it may be useful to look at some of the other professionals who claim to have insight, skill, or expertise in this field. Let us first look at the priest. Now, you remember that the various parts of the mind and the body we described in the previous lecture were as follows: the conscious mind, the subconscious mind, the brain, the body, and then we mentioned something called consciousness, which was associated with personality. Now, consciousness is the awareness of being aware. Consciousness is aware that you are aware. Now, this really, the consciousness part of us, is more aptly dealt with in the course on parapsychology. I mention it here because we're talking about other professionals who claim to be expert in these fields. Of course, the priest claims to be an expert in consciousness. The priest claims to understand and relate to the source of consciousness. The priest claims to understand and relate to the purpose of consciousness. Now, you need only worry about consciousness insofar that it is the consciousness of the being in front of you which you actually hypnotize. But you hypnotize them through their mind, their brain, and their body. But of course, it is actually the conscious self which experiences the hypnotism. So the priest claims to be an expert in consciousness, and he also often will claim to be an expert in the conscious and the subconscious mind because he wrongly defines these in terms of consciousness. The priest's attitude basically is, if you give yourself to the particular religion of his following, or to the founder of that religion, totally and utterly, then in some way you will be saved, your sins will be forgiven, you will have a happy afterlife, or you will be reincarnated in a better situation than you are present reincarnated. And in fact, he explains everything in terms of his relationship to the source of consciousness and the purpose of consciousness. Then we have the psychiatrist. Now, there's a whole lecture on psychiatry, but briefly, psychiatrists divide into two groups. The first group are those that are employed by the state. These are the psychiatrists which run the institutions in various parts of the world. They are employed by and paid by the state. And almost to an entire member of that profession, each psychiatrist who is employed by the state will use methods to solve the problems of the human mind based on the changing of brain chemistry or the changing of brain electrical capacity or brain waves by the use of either psychotropic drugs and or electric shock treatment. Now, another form of psychiatrist is the psychiatrist who's self-employed, who wishes, rather like we do, to run a practice. And those tend to be a different breed. Most of these, in fact, are in the United States of America. In England, nearly every psychiatrist is employed by the state. In the Soviet Union, nearly every psychiatrist is employed by the state. But in the United States of America, although the various states of America do employ psychiatrists, there's a large number of psychiatrists who are in private practice. Now, some of these psychiatrists in private practice also use psychotropic drugs and electric shock treatment. But many of them can be described as analytical psychiatrists, and they do not use psychotropic drugs or electric shock treatment. In fact, some psychiatrists in the USA have small notices in their offices saying that they will not commit anyone to a state institution. In other words, they will not sign the papers, which they have the right to do as members of the psychiatric profession, to commit somebody involuntarily to a mental health hospital. So you see, we have a different type of psychiatrist. So to label all psychiatrists under the same badge will be a wrong assumption. If we relate to psychiatry at all, then we relate to those psychiatrists who do not use psychotropic drugs, who do not use electric shock treatment, who do not commit people involuntarily against their will to institutions, through the courts, as is required in America, or through their signature, as required in England. Now remember that the background of psychiatrists is basically they are medical doctors who have been trained in the use of and understanding of drugs in connection with the body. And their psychiatric science tends to be an extension of that body chemistry to brain chemistry. There would be some measure of agreement and understanding with the psychiatrist who does not use psychotropic drugs, who does not commit people to mental institutions, and who does not use electric shock therapy. Now, these psychiatrists may well themselves use in their practice hypnosis. Now, the third type of professional, or rather pseudo-professional, who claims to have some understanding of the conscious and the subconscious mind is the psychologist. And when we talk about psychologists, there are various types of psychologists. There are educational psychologists who work with children in schools. There are industrial psychologists who work with firms in factories, trying to develop good conditions for workers to produce more effort and more goods. When we talk about psychology in the terms of our science, we're really talking about the clinical psychologist. This is a psychologist who agrees with the definitions of psychiatric mental illnesses and also the use of psychotropic drugs or behavioural therapy whereby people are conditioned, rather like in George Orwell's 1984, to perform and produce and to experience along some predetermined pattern, usually the desires of the state or the desires of some organisation which has a vested interest in brainwashing its employees or its subjects. So there's very little we have in common with clinical psychology, because clinical psychology and that part of psychiatry which uses psychotropic drugs and electric shock treatment are very similar and in fact an interrelated profession. So there we have the field of the priest, the field of psychiatry, and the field of clinical psychology. Now, none of these fields have really anything to do with hypnosis. A very, very small number of clinical psychologists may use hypnosis. A very small number of psychiatrists may use hypnosis. There are, of course, a few general practitioners of medicine who use hypnosis. But generally, the medical profession, which includes the general practitioner and the psychiatrist, the clinical psychologist or the priest, have very little understanding or grasp of hypnosis. I was, however, very interested to know that when I was living out west in the state of Colorado, beneath the Rocky Mountains, there were several priests there, some of them from quite established religions, who also practiced privately as hypnotists. Perhaps this is some descending pattern from the old days of the West, when there were a few doctors and one had to turn to someone if one was ill, had some disease or some illness. And that's where the use of hypnosis may have come, or maybe the early settlers learnt it from the Indians, or maybe the witch doctors taught priests. So right on the fringe of some of these professions, a small percent, something like probably 1%, we would find people doing things very similar to what we are doing and also holding similar beliefs. But the hypnotist or the hypnotherapist is an entirely different profession. And I'm very pleased to see that in the United States of America, the profession of hypnotist or hypnotherapist is listed quite separately from the profession of psychologist, psychiatrist, or priest. Now, what is the difference between a hypnotist and a hypnotherapist? Well, basically, a hypnotherapist is someone who uses therapeutic hypnosis. So if you're going to call yourself a hypnotherapist, you're indicating that you are using a therapeutic hypnosis to help your clients. So what is therapeutic hypnosis? Therapeutic hypnosis is defined as the use of hypnosis for the treatment of disease, injury, or illness. So if you're going to use your word hypnotherapy or call yourself a hypnotherapist, you're really indicating that what you are is a hypnotist who uses therapeutic hypnosis, a hypnotist who treats medical illnesses, diseases, or injuries. Now, there's a whole field of hypnosis which has nothing to do with injury, disease, or illness. And therefore I believe someone who calls themselves a hypnotherapist is to some extent limiting their scope of activity. Better to call yourself a hypnotist who also carries out therapeutic hypnosis, giving yourself a broader spectrum. Now, the profession of psychiatrist, the profession of clinical psychologist, and the profession of priest have entirely misunderstood and misinterpreted the function of the conscious and the subconscious mind. The conscious and subconscious mind are a very simple, straightforward mechanism which could be understood by anybody above the age of 8. It is not a vastly complicated subject where only the priest or the psychiatrist or the clinical psychologist could possibly understand the mind after many years of experience. Intelligent youth of 8 years old could be taught the functions of the conscious and the subconscious mind. Provided they are taught the correct function, they have a greater understanding of the human mind than any psychiatrist, any psychologist, or any priest. Because these other professionals are all trying to define the conscious and the subconscious mind in terms of their own beliefs or their own illusions. And basically, the similar thing between the priest, the psychologist, and the psychiatrist is that they all believe in their own religion. Psychiatry is as much a religion as is clinical psychology, as is any other religion. It is a belief structure. It is not a study of facts or a study of events. It is a predisposition to a belief when the addicts or the adepts subsequently try to explain human behaviour in terms of those beliefs. So where do people like Freud and Jung and Hubbard fit into these moulds? Well, Freud was one of the early analytical psychiatrists. He was a medical doctor who studied the mind, and he was an analytical man who did not use psychotropic drugs or electric shock. He really founded the school of analytical psychiatry. And Freud always said, to become an analyst, it was not necessary for you to be a medical doctor. He did in fact write that in many places in his notes. But basically Freud discovered the existence of the subconscious mind, or I should say rather he rediscovered the existence of the subconscious mind. Because all of Freud followed by Jung. Now Jung really was the first medical doctor who was also an analytical psychiatrist to introduce parapsychology into his writings and teachings. And there was a famous dispute between Freud and Jung because Freud did not want to see parapsychology introduced into the field of analytical psychoanalysis, psychology or psychiatry. Whereas Jung always claimed the fundamental portion of the human being which caused his hang-ups, his confusions and his sadness was based on his parapsychological makeup. So Jung was the doctor or the physician or psychiatrist or the analytical psychiatrist or the psychoanalyst who introduced the idea of parapsychology into that science. Now I mentioned the word psychoanalyst. A psychoanalyst is merely a specialist type of analytical psychiatry who practices a discipline known as psychoanalysis. This is ill-defined, it's long-winded, it's probably not very effective, but at least it is not harmful like psychotropic drugs or electric shock treatment. So from time to time you may come across someone practicing as a psychoanalyst. It's a long, drawn-out procedure, usually taking 3 or 4 years, costing large sums of money, leaving the client as unchanged as he was when he started the psychoanalysis, but having made a good friend with his analyst, who no doubt will be withdrawing his standing order from the bank for the rest of his life whilst he attends more sessions of analysis. The fact it doesn't work is evident that the client has to keep on attending for psychoanalysis. And finally, in the evolution of the sciences, we have the story and the evolution of Mr. L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology. Scientology is basically a social system which purports to be a religion which encompasses teachings of Freud, teachings of Jung, some of Hubbard's own teachings, by a high-pressure salesman. Church of Scientology has an income of many millions of dollars and millions of pounds in various parts of the world as a complete social system, very similar in its functioning to belonging to the Communist Party. It's a dictatorial system where no dissent or opinions may be formed by the members, since the opinions and teachings of Hubbard are the only belief structures which are allowed. Just as in Communist Russia, the teachings of Lenin and Marx are the only belief structures that are allowed. Nevertheless, it does in fact produce changes in its members. It does produce a sense of awareness that these members are then taken and put into a system to perpetuate the belief structure. Although Scientology claims to have many millions of members, in fact there are very few people who are actually employed by the church structure. Most of the people who they claim to be members have merely read a book or attended a course. So there we have really the main systems which have been put out, the beliefs, the structures and the teachings. So let us now look at this structure of the human mind. And let us start with the physical structure of the brain. Basically, the brain exists in 3 or 4 distinct levels. Let us take the computer part of the brain. This is known as the brain stem. The brain stem is at the base of the brain. The brain stem is the central computer. And in the computer program are controls for temperature of the body, breathing rates, heart rate, blood pressure, when to open the pores, when to close the pores, and many other basic systems which are run automatic. For instance, when you're asleep, it's the brain stem which looks after your body. So the brain stem is the computer. Has very little to do with the function of consciousness or the subconscious or the conscious. Although some people who have been trained in yoga and some extreme forms of hypnosis can in fact control the function of their brain stem to lower their heartbeats, to lower their blood pressure, to increase body temperature and to lower body temperature. Basically, we're not too concerned with the brain stem. The bottom layer of the brain is a brain which is very similar to the brain of a reptile. It appears that as the brain has evolved, it has evolved not by evolving a new brain, but by using the same ancient parts of the brain to build on. Rather like the first motor car was built with 4 wheels, a radiator and a gearbox, although subsequent motor cars are vastly modernised, they're still basically built on the same structure. And so it is with the brain. Now the next part of the brain, up from the bottom, is in fact the mammalian brain, the brain of the mammal, which functions in a similar way to other mammals. In fact, it controls the function of the suckling of the young and the early feeding of the young, which is necessary for raising mammals. Now, the third part of the brain, which is the most interesting part, is known as the cerebral cortex. It's in 2 halves. It's often referred to as grey matter. It sits at the top of your head. Now, it is this part of the brain which is divided into a left-hand hemisphere and a right-hand hemisphere. Remember, it's the left-hand hemisphere which controls the right-hand side of the body, and the right-hand hemisphere which controls the left-hand side of the body. Now, you remember in the previous lecture that these 2 halves of the brain put out brain waves. And basically, the right-hand half of the brain can be compared with the subconscious mind, and the left-hand side of the brain can be compared with the conscious mind. In fact, the other terms we use for the conscious mind are the rational mind, and we can call the subconscious the irrational mind. So how do these 2 minds interrelate and function? Well, the mind is not the brain, but there is an association between the mind and the brain. Regard the mind as some kind of abstract system. What happens is that we use the left-hand side of the brain, the conscious mind, the rational mind, to calculate mathematical functions. We use it for reading, use it for writing. When we're driving an automobile, we're using our rational mind. And also, of course, our rational facts that we need to function. Now, the rational memory, each portion, each part of the rational memory is like a separate videotape, which contains as many as 50 perceptics, even things like the magnetic field, whether they're upside down, the temperature, body sensations, all forms of perceptics from our five senses containing all sorts of information are recorded on those videotapes which form part of our rational memory. And when we wish to recall part of our rational memory, we merely search our rational memories rather like a librarian looking for a book with a reference system. We select the appropriate memory, feed it into our conscious mind, and then function on that memory, which we apply to the new data which we are observing, studying, feeling, or experiencing. So in other words, the rational mind or the conscious mind is a form of computer, just like the hardware, with the rational memory being the software. The problem is that if we ever experience an emotional shock or a physical shock, immediately our conscious mind or rational mind will shut off. And all the information and experiences or our input is fed into our irrational mind or our subconscious mind and laid down in that subconscious mind. Unlike the rational memory, these things are not laid down in any form of a logical sequence. They are laid down in an illogical sequence which functions on association. So whereas the conscious mind will function on the basis that if the rational memory tells it that 1 plus 1 equals 2, then the conscious mind will tell you that 2 plus 2 equals 4 and 4 plus 4 equals 8. The irrational, the subconscious mind, works on the basis that A equals B equals C equals D equals E. If it would feed incorrect data into a computer, then it will give you incorrect answers. So somebody who has their subconscious mind open will be behaving in an irrational fashion because they're behaving on the basis that A equals B equals C equals D, and not on the basis of their conscious mind and their rational memory, whereas 1 plus 1 equals 2 and 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now remember, it's only during a moment of emotional or physical shock that this switch occurs between the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. But the problem is that once this program is laid down in the subconscious or the irrational mind, then at a later point, if there is a similar experience or similar association, then this subconscious mind can be triggered off. And when that happens, then the conscious mind is once again switched down, even though there is the lack of presence of a physical or emotional shock. So you see, once this program is laid down, any emotional or physical shock contained in it can be re-stimulated by a similar incident, a similar associative instance, or a similar association. So somebody could be going about their normal day and suddenly something happens which associates with that a moment of physical or emotional shock. The conscious mind will shut down, the subconscious mind will open up, and into the computer will be fed irrational thoughts, irrational memories and associations, which will cause irrational behaviour, cause the person to be reacting to that emotional, physical trauma which occurred some considerable time ago. To give an example, suppose a young child at the age of 5 experiences a bad interaction with fire, which will result in the burning of that child. The moment the child is burnt, the child is experiencing a physical traumatic shock, probably also some emotional shock. The conscious mind is closed down, the subconscious mind is open. Everything associated with that instant is laid down in the subconscious mind. Suppose the child is standing on a red carpet, and suppose it was raining, and there's a black cat in the room. When the child has recovered from the moment of shock, starting to realise it's burnt itself, going through grief and other unpleasant feelings of pain, and as the subconscious mind closes, so it will contain the sequence red carpet equals black cat equals raining equals fire. That subconscious memory, that irrational memory, will be filed away in illogical sequence. 10 years later, child may be walking along on a rainy day, come across a black cat, and be looking into a shop window showing pictures of some kind of flames. Suddenly the child, because of the resulting association, could start to behave very strangely, start to behave irrationally, and have a tremendous sense of fear, start to move away from the shop window. The interesting thing is that if you ask the child what's happening, the child would give you some rational explanation, like they suddenly wanted to go home, they were unhappy and want to get home because they were hungry or because they wanted to go out to play with their friends. They wouldn't be aware of the reason that they are reacting. And this is a very important factor. They're not aware of the reason they're acting this way. Because if they were aware of the reason, then if they could unravel the associations, then there would no longer be the effect of the traumatic experience. Now that, of course, is just an example of a physical trauma. An example of an emotional trauma would be seeing your mother and father involved in some violent physical fight or something similar to that. This could result in an emotional shock. Again, a series of associations could be laid down in the subconscious mind, and later they could be re-stimulated. So every trauma that is laid down in the subconscious mind, whether it be caused by physical or emotional shock, can in fact result in a traumatic experience, a sequence laid down on the basis of association, and any one of those associative ideas could result in the re-stimulation of that trauma at a later date. And when that trauma is re-stimulated, the person could be behaving in an irrational way without realising why they are behaving like that, because they wouldn't have access to data in the subconscious mind which is being fed into the conscious mind. This is a very fundamental mechanism. It's very easy to understand it. Now, obviously, we all have traumas laid down in our subconscious mind. And obviously, from time to time, we're going to be re-stimulated, and these traumas are going to be fed into our conscious mind. We're going to react to situations, and we're going to act in a basis of A equals B equals C equals D, instead of logically on the basis that 2 plus 2 equals 4, and 4 plus 4 equals 8. Now, the important thing as to whether a person is behaving rationally or irrationally is not the number of traumas that they may have in their subconscious mind, but the degree of re-stimulation which they experience, which causes these irrational traumas to be fed into the subconscious mind. So when the trauma is fed into the subconscious mind, we call this re-stimulation. And there are many cases of people having their subconscious memories re-stimulated and behaving irrationally. It is very important to remember that when you're having data fed from your subconscious mind into your conscious mind, you're not aware that the reason that you're acting the way that you're acting is because of the subconscious mind. Because if you were aware, then you wouldn't be reacting this way. And the interesting thing is that the phenomenon of hypnosis, a method of programming the conscious mind and the subconscious mind simultaneously, can be used to lay down in the subconscious mind a logical pattern of behaviour. Hence, when you are trying to purposefully, with the left-hand side of your mind, when you're not in the hypnotic state, when you're trying to pursue this goal, you have the override mechanism of the subconscious mind telling the conscious mind also to behave this way simultaneously. You therefore have the effect of a double effort, a double reinforcement, which can increase performance and the attainment of that goal by as much as 25%. Also under hypnosis, it is possible to run out existing traumas in the subconscious mind so that you reach the point where you have no traumas in your subconscious mind other than the ones that you have laid down under hypnosis constructively. Now this really brings us to the two definite forms of hypnosis. One is suggestion hypnosis, which is the laying down in the subconscious mind and the conscious mind a positive program of reinforcement. And also the hypnosis where you are removing existing traumas which are causing irrational behaviour. Now the way these traumas function when they are fed into the conscious mind is basically in two ways. The first is the causing of a psychosomatic illness. In other words, the associative program is causing the malfunction or the sensation of pain, discomfort, illness, injury, or similar. Other way these traumas can affect the person is causing them to become misemotional, i.e. to experience some form of unpleasant emotion and distress. There are only the two ways to go, either a psychosomatic or it's an emotional, irrational disturbance. Now, as many as 80% of all illnesses are not really illnesses at all in the acceptable sense, but in fact are caused by psychosomatic illness, which is in turn caused by traumas in the subconscious mind. All irrational behaviour or misemotional behaviour is caused by emotional traumas in the subconscious mind being re-stimulated. And these traumas can be re-stimulated from any of the associative pattern which is laid down in the subconscious mind. And we regard these associations as link points. And every time you get a link point re-stimulated, the whole of the trauma goes into re-stimulation. And the first time that trauma is re-stimulated, we refer to this as a T2 trauma. The original trauma we refer to as a T3 trauma. And every subsequent re-stimulation of the T3 trauma after the first time we call a T1 trauma. So there we are, we have the T3, which is the laying down of the original trauma. Then we have the T2, which is the first time that trauma is re-stimulated. And every subsequent re-stimulation we refer to as a T1 trauma. So there could be lots of T1s, but there's only one T2, which is the first time that trauma is re-stimulation. The first time the trauma goes into re-stimulation, there is normally a great deal of grief, discomfort, and physical or emotional pain, psychosomatic pain. And after that, the re-stimulation tends to be less dramatic, but there is still re-stimulation, and each re-stimulation is also laid down as another trauma. So these traumas, in fact, come in chains. They come in chains of T1s leading to a T2, and there at the bottom of the chain is the T3. Now, these traumas are not laid down in any form of logical time sequence. A trauma that occurred 20 years ago could be more readily available for re-stimulation than the trauma, say, laid down about a year ago. And when we think of illness, disease or injury, there are three distinct phases. One is the predisposition stage. Then there is the acute stage. And then there is the recovery stage. Traumas caused by physical or emotional shock can make one more predisposed towards disease, injury or illness. They can also slow up the recovery period. There's no evidence that the acute stage is affected, i.e. the stage attended to by the medical doctor. The acute stage is not affected by the traumas. The recovery stage and the predisposition stage are. So people who have had their traumas run out are less predisposed towards illness, disease or injury, and also will recover quicker from disease, illness or injury. In fact, people who have been hypnotised after a form of illness or disease or injury will also recover quicker if hypnosis is used even without running out the traumas. If you ran out the traumas before the person became acutely ill, then of course the post-recovery period will be far quicker. There are basically 5 reactions or methods of behaviour which a person exhibits when they are under the effect of the trauma. The best way to demonstrate these is to imagine a person's reaction to a tiger sitting at the top of the stairs. You can attack the tiger, you can run away from the tiger, you can avoid the tiger, you can pretend the tiger isn't there, or you can submit to the tiger. Somebody who is exhibiting the re-stimulation of a trauma will either attack a situation, run away from the situation, avoid a situation, pretend the situation doesn't exist, or they will succumb to the situation. So one way to decide whether a person is behaving as a result of a re-stimulation of a trauma is to see if they're exhibiting compulsively any of those 5 areas of behaviour. So the important thing is that hypnosis is another way of switching this mechanism on and off. A person who is under hypnosis has their conscious mind shut down and their subconscious mind open. Of course, they can still receive the words that you're saying through their subconscious mind. They can hear what you say, they know what they're doing, but their subconscious mind is open, and the program that is being offered to them is being laid down in their subconscious mind. So when you bring them out of hypnosis, their subconscious mind is closed off, and then instead of having an arbitrary program laid down, you have laid down, in fact, what represents a positive trauma plus a method of re-stimulation. So when that trauma that you've laid down is re-stimulated, this has a positive effect on the behaviour of the individual instead of a negative effect. A large number of hypnosis processes, which will be released later on in this course, are in fact suggestive processes for laying down programs in the subconscious mind to change behaviour, to change attitudes, to increase the ability of a person, increase their results they get in their life, increase their skills, increase the stimulation and the staying power of an athlete, the ability of a salesman to close on a transaction, and so on and so forth. All these will be given to you as processes. Now remember that in section 2 of this course, the techniques, the induction techniques that you have been given are not processes. They are not techniques to put suggestions into the subconscious mind, other than the normal suggestions of well-being which is given with every session of hypnosis, nor are they processes for running out traumas in the subconscious mind. They are merely induction techniques to enable you to hypnotise another person efficiently and effectively. You should rehearse these notes, you should record these notes on your tape recorder, play your tape recorder back and see how you sound, because these are the actual induction processes. Now we have covered in this lecture the subconscious and the conscious mind, the rational memory and the irrational memory, and also the rational mind and the conscious mind. I'd also mention here the genetic mind. Now the genetic mind is the means by which an embryo knows how to evolve into a fish, a bird, a mammal or an animal. In other words, it's a form of memory contained in the genes which makes quite sure cells divide according to the appropriate blueprint to suit the particular species which are reproducing themselves. So you don't have to worry too much about the genetic mind, but I mention it because it is in our notes and it has a form of mind of its own. And it does contain cellular memory, which is inherited memory, which can sometimes be related to inherited traits, because basically there are two types of traits, those that are inherited and those that are learned. Most of what you function on is learned, but there are some inherited traits which can bring about some form of latent memory, which is a kind of cellular race memory, which is related to your family and of course is related to your genes which are running in that family, which are reproducing themselves by cellular reactions and can sometimes contain memories of your own family tree. But basically, this is not all that important, I just mention it. Another thing I would mention is that people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol can also have their conscious mind closed down, and then irrational behaviour is fed into the conscious from the subconscious, and people who are under drugs or alcohol can also lay down traumas. So to get drunk can be quite destructive, because one starts to react on A equals B equals C situation, which is a form of behaviour I'm sure we have all seen from time to time. You see a person who is totally in their subconscious mind and reacting traumas. I hope you've enjoyed Section 2 lecture on this course, and I look forward to sending you Section 3. This has been recorded in stereo, but may be played on a stereo or an ordinary recorder. Thank you.